5 minutes at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yes, I would. Thank you for holding this very important hearing. Voting rights is not going away, even though the Senate last night failed to do what it should have done. And in some respects, we can call it a racist Senate. The same way that we can talk about racism when it comes to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle making statements today about Black people and Democrats race baiting. It's like, when you mention about how much of racism still exists in the soil of America, they want to plant their heads in that soil and refuse to acknowledge what's in the soil. And it's they've been emboldened now, Mr. Chairman. My colleague from Texas, I'm sure, would not have felt comfortable in talking like he spoke 3 or 4 years ago.
Mr. Roy, he's back with us. I appreciate a Republican being with us. I just want to make that known.
We're good. Because of the election of Donald Trump and the Make America White Again movement, he feels empowered to be able to say what he wants to say. He knows that it's wrong, but he feels entitled. He feels privileged. It's white privilege, it's white power that allows him to say what he said. And I'm just blown away by where we have fallen in our discourse on this committee. But at any rate, we heard about Mr. Henderson. I'd like to ask you, Georgia is one of the nation's fastest growing states, and this growth has largely been driven by people of color. Over the last decade, Georgia's Black population grew by 16%, almost 500,000 people, while the population of white Georgians has decreased. And yet, the new legislative maps do not reflect this tremendous growth of Georgia's Black population. Mr. Henderson, the Supreme Court has declared partisan gerrymandering challenges a non-justiciable political question, but it has continuously held that states may not engage in intentional racial gerrymandering. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Johnson. That is correct.
And to be clear, district maps are presumptively unconstitutional when race is the predominant motivating factor in the legislature's redrawing of congressional and legislative maps, correct?
That is also correct.
How are you able to show race as a motivating factor?
I think, thank you for the question. And my colleague, Tom Sines, who represents MALDEF, I thought ably answered that question in response to an earlier inquiry. It is extremely difficult to establish the fact pattern necessary to show that redistricting was based exclusively on race or predominantly on race. And it makes challenging redistricting in a way that would show racial gerrymandering extremely difficult to accomplish. One has to look at the totality of circumstances and deduce from those circumstances that race was the predominant factor, and that is extremely hard to do. I'm now quite familiar with what's going on in Arizona because in a meeting recently with Senator Sinema to point out why having a debate on voting rights was so necessary, we pointed out the demographic changes that have taken place in that state over the past 10 years. We pointed out the fact that since the Shelby County decision, 320 polling places in Arizona were closed. 70% of polling places in Maricopa County, the most diverse county in the state, have been closed. And at the same time, the legislature adopted recently a limitation on mail-in voting, which Arizonans used 80% of the population. When you combine those factors together, the heavy reliance on mail-in balloting, the closure of polling places, and restrictions that affect Native American households because of their lack of mailing addresses, other information, when you look at the attacks on election workers that have occurred in the aftermath of the 2020 election and the fraudulent review of voting procedures conducted by the so-called cyber ninjas in Arizona, the first of its kind, the totality of circumstances lays the foundation which allows you to help evaluate both what's happening in the election process and the gerrymandering circumstance. But others may be familiar with Georgia specifically.
Mr. Johnson, your time is up, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just leave with the fact that it would be only 6 blind mice on the Supreme Court who could not be able to look through the facade and under a totality of the circumstances rule correctly. And I'm not confident that that will happen. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We are now at an unusual time in our hearing in that we have Mr. Garcia.